When Jennifer Bush was born in 1985, her mother Kathy called her a dream child. Kathy and her husband had already had 2 boys, and she was finally having a daughter, and she was so happy about that. At first, she seemed perfectly happy and healthy, normal kid, but before too long, she began seeing the pediatrician with one illness after another. Respiratory problems, ear infections, diarrhea. Her health seemed to be declining for some reason, but the doctors couldn't figure out what was causing this. They determined that she had a rare immune disorder which required her to have an IV. But Jennifer was just a tiny kid. But because she was so small and her veins were so tiny, she had to have the IV pump implanted permanently into her chest. That didn't seem to help Jennifer. Her health kept declining. Kathy said that she was now having seizures, severe abdominal pain, and couldn't keep her food down. At 3 years old, she was put on an anti-seizure drug called Tegretol, which apparently in high doses itself can cause seizures, which is really dumb. By the time she was 5 years old, she had to have a feeding tube implanted into her stomach. And then at 7, she was diagnosed with a rare infection, a polymicrobial sepsis. Meanwhile, Kathy quit her job, but of course not to stay home with her sick daughter. She was quitting her job to lose her medical insurance. At the same time, they were racking up hundreds and thousands of dollars in medical bills. Instead, Kathy took a job as office manager at Jennifer's pediatrician's office. This is where she had complete access to Jennifer's doctors and all of her medical files. To get help for paying these medical bills, she reached out to various charities near their Florida home. The charities and individual people gave generously to Jennifer. She was a beautiful little girl, and before long she was kind of a local celebrity in the town. They had put her on TV, newspapers, she was in parades. Kathy became a devoted activist for healthcare reform. She and Jennifer even went to Washington, D.C. to meet with the First Lady at the time. Kathy would always say that she had to choose between the treatments and groceries, which helped her get donations so she could rely on the generousness of others. But at the same time, she was saying that she had to choose between treatments and groceries. The family was taking resort vacations and buying a new motorcycle and even a new sports car. In 1991, though, the staff at Coral Springs Medical Center, which is the hospital that Jennifer was always at, began seeing the red flags. They started seeing punctured or IV lines that had been tampered with. There was also some confusing and false statements about Jennifer's symptoms and diagnoses. Kathy would always try and push more tests and more procedures, so the nursing staff took their concerns to the doctor. With this information and the reviewing of Jennifer's medical records, the doctor concluded that Kathy Bush may have Munchausen syndrome by proxy. He believed that this was the motivation behind what he thought were acts of medical abuse committed by Kathy on Jennifer. This is something that has to be reported right away, so he informed Child Protective Services of what he thought was going on. In 1995, there was an anonymous call placed by a nurse at another hospital where Jennifer was a frequent patient at. This nurse contacted the child abuse hotline as she felt that this was necessary. She told them that she had observed some troubling things during Jennifer's tons of stays there. She had seen her mother tampering with IV lines. Later, those IV lines would malfunction. Jennifer would also have higher levels of drugs in her system that either weren't supposed to be there or didn't work with her prescribed dosages. There were even times when her urine samples seemed to have been swapped out with somebody else's. The anonymous nurse reported that she had come to recognize a pattern with Jennifer. Right before she was scheduled to be discharged, she was happy and she seemed to be recovering wonderfully, but Then she would suffer a seizure, and nobody knew why. It always happened when the nurses weren't in the room. She'd go from being fine to pale, lethargic, and vomiting everywhere. The nurse also said that Kathy kind of treated her daughter as no more than a prop. When media would come around, she would make sure that she was looking sickly, either being in bed or surrounded by tubes to give off the more sick appearance. The nurse also said, which is really disturbing, was that Kathy appeared to be almost euphoric when she would get the attention. This tip was sent over to the Florida State prosecutors. They were building a case against Kathy for medical abuse of her child. Through that investigation, they found several medical professionals who had either seen Kathy tampering with her daughter's treatment or saw things in the little girl's chart that just were not right. There was one incident that really stood out. After Jennifer had been prescribed that Tegretol for seizures, the level of the drug in her bloodstream began to spike to near lethal territories. So, the doctor who prescribed it put a hold on it, meaning that it would not be given out by the pharmacy. Yet for 3 weeks afterwards, Jennifer's Tegretol levels remained high, occasionally spiking again near lethal levels. So in 1995, police arrested Kathy Bush and charged her with aggravated child abuse and Medicaid fraud. Jennifer was taken from school that day and put in foster care. By this time, she had been hospitalized over 200 times and undergone almost 40 surgeries. She had her gallbladder removed, her appendix, and part of her intestines, as well as almost 2,000 non-surgical treatments. Yet soon after being taken out of her mother's custody, Jennifer's feeding tube was safely removed, and amazingly, she was cured and all of her illnesses faded away. Kathy Bush's trial started in 1999. Before the trial started, the judge, for whatever reason, said that he was not going to accept any testimonies or evidence having to do with Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The reason for this is because the diagnosis itself is still somewhat controversial. It was even more controversial then. The prosecution would have to prove that Kathy had committed medical abuse on Jennifer, no more nor less. Kathy's defense was that she was simply concerned with her daughter and doing everything that a mother could to take care of her sick daughter. The accusations of medical abuse, she said, were just the doctors trying to get revenge on her for her activism. There were dozens of doctors and medical professionals, nurses, all over the region who had treated Jennifer. They all testified of patterns of mysterious symptoms that only Kathy seemed to witness. There was fake medical histories and diagnoses, always tampering with medical equipment. There was drugs in Jennifer's system, contaminated feeding tubes or catheters. And there was some that only could have been explained by the introduction of fecal matter. They also testified to the multiple incidents where Jennifer would seem to just recover, only to get worse after her mother had visited. The doctor who was caring for her at the time of the trial also testified. Since being out of her mother's care, she had been perfectly healthy. The only illness she had gotten was from a viral infection, which she recovered from. After 7 hours, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty for Kathy. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, followed by another 5 of probation. At the sentencing hearing, a CPS caseworker read a letter from Jennifer. In it, Jennifer explained that she was deeply hurt by what was happening and what her mother had done to her. Jennifer also said that she was experiencing a lot of grief. The state of Florida was pursuing a case to take Jennifer away from Kathy. Kathy decided that she was going to voluntarily give away her rights to Jennifer to not put her family through any more turmoil. Kathy was granted parole in 2005 after serving 3 years only. But that's not where this ends. Though Kathy was prohibited from seeing Jennifer, in 2004 she began writing to her from prison. The two began corresponding by mail with supervision by a therapist. Jennifer was being bounced around from foster care to foster care system. She describes this experience as very traumatic and missed having a stable connection to a loving mother. When Jennifer turned 18, she requested that the prohibition against contact with her mother be lifted, and it was granted. Now, Jennifer is close with her mother and maintains that Kathy never abused her. She hasn't given out any information on her current health condition, but she appears to be healthy and happy.